Bonjour, mon nom est Jean-Marc Mangin. I'm the president and CEO of Philanthropic Foundations Canada. It was a great pleasure that we're hosting this webinar today. And it's not only because it's Black History Month. It's a concrete expression of PFC commitment to its new statement of values that equity-seeking philanthropy needs a much bigger place in the ecosystem. And we have a lot of work to do to get there. So some of you will recall that last October, we had a webinar with some of the participants of some of the panelists today. But there's been some very interesting and fascinating developments and also hopeful developments since then. So I'm very hopeful that, this is a step an important step in the journey of creating that a vibrant ecosystem for Black-led philanthropy in the context of that equity-seeking philanthropy needs to take its valuable expression in our ecosystem. So before we do that, let me first begin with the land acknowledgement. So we would like to acknowledge the many territories of Turtle Island on which we work and reside. These territories are home to many Indigenous people who have lived here for tens of thousands of years and continue to live here as settlers, immigrants, and descendants, and as visitors. We honor and respect the many Indigenous peoples of this land and hope for a more just future together. Je voudrais mentionner également que nous avons la traduction simultanée, so we have a translation that you can just pop out if need be. Please use the Q&A box to ask questions and the chat box to make comments during the next hour. So it's with great pleasure that I'd like to introduce our moderator for today, Liban Abokar. Liban is Executive Director of Youth Leaps, a Toronto-based nonprofit organization that supports Black youth to improve their education and employment outcomes. Liban was a founding member of Ontario's first ever Premier's Council on Youth Opportunities, which helped enhance Ontario's Youth Action Plan. He's also a former board member for the Laidlaw Foundation, the PFC member, where he chaired the granting committee, and the Catherine Donnelly Foundation, another PFC member. Most recently, Liban co-authored the groundbreaking research report Unfunded Black communities, and is a member of the working group to establish the foundations for Black communities. So over to you, Liban.
Merci, Jean-Marc. I am incredibly honored to be here today. I have the privilege of moderating what I hope to be a very informative and exciting panel discussion on how we can create greater equity within the philanthropic community here in Canada. The folks you'll hear from today are not only practitioners, leaders, thought leaders, but also some folks who are challenging and championing the systems and informing this change. So without further ado, what I'm going to do is take a few moments to just quickly read through some short bios and introduce every one of our panelists, and then we'll get into the discussion. First, I'd like to introduce Dr. Jacqueline Bouvier-Copeland, who founded the Black Philanthropy Month. She's the co-founder of the Pan-Canadian Women's Philanthropy Network, a global association of African descent and allied leaders, donors, and activists of all backgrounds. The founder and chair of the WISE Fund, which supports women technologists of Indigenous and African descent with promising eco-health solutions to climate change that also advance the social and economic well-being of disadvantaged communities in Africa, Australia, Brazil, and the United States. Jackie serves on the board of advisors for the alternative energy company, Uncharted Power. For more, you'll receive additional information in the following of this panel on how to follow and learn more about the wonderful work Jackie's leading. Next, we have Fabrice Ville of Portois Point. Fabrice is a certified integral development coach, lawyer, and formerly a basketball coach. In 2011, Fabrice founded Portois Point, an organization that trains sports coaches so that they play a role of life coaches with youth in disadvantaged neighborhoods. Driven by equal opportunity for all, he regularly talks about issues regarding this ideal, in particular as a public speaker and facilitator of workshops and workshops with companies. Fabrice is fascinated by the question of human consciousness. He wishes that people would be curious about the visible violence in which they participate and that they respond to it with kindness for themselves and others. Glad to have you here, Fabrice. Next, we have Sadia Zaman. Sadia, it brings a wealth of arts and media, a wealth of experience in arts, media, not-for-profit, in the not-for-profit world. In her role as the CEO of Inspirit Foundation. Before joining Inspirit, Sadia was managing director of the Royal Ontario Museum, where she focused on digital content and Indigenous narratives. Before the ROM, Sadia commissioned documentary and current affair projects from across the country as director of original program and development for CBC News and Centers. She also led Women in Film Television Toronto, a not-for-profit that supports the training and advancement of women in screen-based industry. Sadia began her career as a journalist, creating hundreds of hours of original, critically acclaimed current affairs and documentary content for Vision TV, CBC, and TVO. She's won dozens of awards for her journalism and has been honored for her leadership. She sits on many juries and advisory committees and is often asked to speak to media around equity and leadership issues. Thank you, Sadia. Really happy to have you here. Finally, I have the privilege of introducing Rebecca Darwin. Rebecca is a natural community leader, motivated by deep curiosity, connecting people and systems thinking. Over the past 10 years, Rebecca has honed her partnership skills in diverse professional environments, including the streets of New York City, the political halls of Ontario's Queen's Park, and the heart of technology innovation in Silicon Valley. In each role, Rebecca has driven creative solutions to complex problems through strategic planning, team leadership, policy development, program management, and group facilitation. Rebecca is an advocate and champion of diversity, inclusion, and most importantly, equity across her professional, volunteer, and professional domains. And if I can add, this isn't in Rebecca's bio, but it's something that recently happened. Rebecca recently was named by Future of Good, and by recent, I mean literally as of today, as one of the 10 Black leaders in Canada who are making a change in social impact. So thank you all for being here. Excited about the conversations we'll have. And without further ado, I'll make a quick comment on why we're here and then jump into the questions. In December of 2020 of this year, a report was released that was already referenced by Jean-Marc called the Unfunded report. The report drew a very stark picture of a broken and inequitable relationship between Black communities and Canadian philanthropy. When this report was released, the authors were very anxious to see how the sector would respond. Encouragingly, those who received this report not merely saw this as a criticism, but as a call to action, an opportunity to reverse the abysmal trend of underfunding and see the emergence of a fairer and more just landscape that's supportive of not only Black communities, but all communities here in this country. It's in this spirit of a call to action that the research hopes that we'll take concrete steps and outlines those concrete steps, which gathers us here today. Through this discussion, you'll hear from practitioners and leaders within philanthropy about how we can understand the implications of the report and bring to fruition its recommendations. With that said, let's hear directly from these folks. We're now going to jump into our question and answer period. So first question, folks. A key finding in the report suggested that the current ecosystem of Canadian foundations wasn't adequately meeting the resource and capacity needs of Black-led and Black-serving organizations, and therefore failed to address the complex and intersectional needs of marginalized communities like Black communities. This question is to the whole panel. In your view, how accurate do you think this assessment is and why? Sadia, why don't we begin with you?
Sure. Thank you, first of all, for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here with some of you who I know and with new folks as well. I think that regardless of where in philanthropy our priorities lie, whether it be media and arts like the Inspirit Foundation or in other spaces, there is an intersectionality of experiences and an intersectionality that crosses into virtually every sector imaginable. Everything from housing to the environment, to the justice system, and also in terms of narrative and having power in terms of driving the narrative and representation of Black communities and Black individuals within our media and arts ecosystems. These are all they're all interwoven, they're all connected. And every single issue touches Black communities in one way or another. And I think somehow in philanthropy, sometimes we can fail to see that intersectionality of experiences. And so, yes, it touches every single one of us in every way, in all the work that we do.
Thank you for that. Why don't I go to Fabrice? Do you have any thoughts on the question and maybe some of the comments your colleague just shared?
Sure. I mean, one thing that I would say is that, if we look at philanthropy in general, I think it would be fair to acknowledge that philanthropy itself cannot alone solve any social problem, right? And when we're talking about racism in general, when we're talking about anti-Black racism, I think it would be fair to say that it also applies to that specific context. So if we're talking about the failure of philanthropy to address and support whether it be Black-led foundations and tackle issues faced by Black communities, then it's not only philanthropy, but society in general that is basically failing. But if we are to look at philanthropy itself specifically, one thing that I've observed is the fact that until recently, we have refused in Canada to acknowledge the fact that Black communities have been affected specifically by major problems. And if we compare that phenomenon to what we observe in the US, where we are aware of these issues, they're being named and addressed, we're at the tip of the iceberg in Canada in being able to acknowledge that there are issues that should be named as Black issues and that should be addressed accordingly.
Thank you for that. So, Rebecca, you just heard from your colleagues around the need to name systemic anti-Black racism as a key issue. You've heard about the intersectional needs that foundations may be missing. I wonder what additional points you might have.
Absolutely. I would say that the report has provided evidence base to what Black communities have been saying for decades. Anecdotally, there has always been an acknowledgement that there has been woeful underfunding. And so the report really highlights what we've known for a very long time. And that woeful underfunding comes from a lack of understanding. So I think it's really important to name a component of the anti-Black racism that's happening in the philanthropic sector is a lack of Black communities and decision-making powers, whether it is in board governance or on the operational side as staff. The philanthropic sector is largely a white institution within a Canadian context. And so there's a gap in understanding of what the needs are of Black communities because we simply don't have a seat at that table. In addition to the report that the Foundation for Black Communities launched in December, we did an accompanying needs assessment. I think it's really important to highlight some of the findings from that needs assessment. So we surveyed 110 Black-led, Black-serving, and Black-focused organizations in Canada. And we found that out of that 110, 69% of those organizations felt that they were inadequately supported by funders. And in addition to that, 80% felt that foundations and funders didn't understand their priorities and their needs. So what we see in the report is a reflection of what we see on the ground.
Thank you for that. Dr. Copeland, your co-panelists have talked about the challenges of not-for-profit organizations that are Black-led, Black-focused, feeling as though their issues aren't understood. You've heard from your co-panelists that there's an issue around needing to name specifically systemic anti-Black racism, and that the issues that we're finding within Canadian philanthropy almost are reflective of the other challenges we find across society at large. I wonder, from your perspective, given what you just heard about the Canadian context, how does that resonate with you from your global experience?
Most unfortunately, it sounds typical. And it's not surprising if you think of the history of slavery and neocolonialism that got us to this hemisphere in the first place. And so systemic racism, anti-Black racism, anti-Indigenous racism is a part of the history of North America. And that is an empirical and historical fact. And so it is not surprising that we do not have equal access to any sort of private capital, be it philanthropy. I sit in Silicon Valley. I'm here in California today. And there are all of these statistics that say people of color get at best 2% of venture capital funding and social investment. And for women, it's even worse. It's almost statistically 0 for Black and Indigenous women, and at best 1%. And so I consider this movement the last frontier of the civil rights movement, the human rights movement for Black people. There cannot be equity, there cannot be justice unless all people, including Black people, have equal access to private capital. And it is especially critical now. Just in the US context, half of the people who die from COVID are Black. 60% of our small businesses are closed. There are a lot of reasons for that. Some of them related to systemic racism and just the class structure of our country, and our communities, along with Latinos, tend to be the frontline workers. Even now, news reports are indicating that we do not get equal access to the coronavirus, even though Black, Indigenous, and Latino people have the highest rates of COVID and COVID deaths. So it is unfortunate because there has been so many lives lost in the fight for Black human rights. And I'm increasingly saying human rights because civil rights are human rights. This is an effort to ensure that the full humanity of Black people is respected. And I say that because there's now this white supremacist backlash that says that speaking out about inequity and racism is racist. It's the ultimate form of gaslighting. However, it's just really important to put the Black, and I would say funding movement, because we need equity in philanthropy and private business investment, especially if our communities are to recover from the carnage of COVID and the pandemic recession. And so I'm very delighted that Canada is starting to organize. There are many communities. I mean, Canada in a way reminds me, interestingly, of Brazil. There is a Black consciousness movement in Brazil that's relatively new. And as part of that, organizing around equity in public capital, including philanthropy, but until maybe the past 5 to 10 years, it was considered destructive to overtly name structural racism and to organize against it. It was considered un-Brazilian, unpatriotic. And so I'm delighted that Canada's Black community is not buying into that false ideology. Canada has a reputation internationally for its human rights, and that includes Black people. So congratulations on the Unfunded report and creating the Foundation for Black Communities. And thanks to Philanthropic Foundations Canada for hosting this event. Kudos to everyone.
Thanks so much. I mean, a lot was covered there. We're hearing, one of the things that I want to tease from that was a really strong statement that's made around access to capital as a fundamental last frontier towards the achievement of full civic and human rights. I think that's a really interesting comment to make. The report that was been referenced revealed that as little as 16 cents for every $100 that was granted by Canada's leading foundations went to Black communities. I wonder, as someone leading a not-for-profit organization, Fabrice, what is this level of funding? How does this level of funding affect the work that you do or organizations like yourself? What would funding equity have meant, or what does funding inequity mean now?
Yeah, so I would say a couple of things. I think that I'll answer by referring to two time periods of the journey of Pour Trois Points. If we look at, I mean, we're a fairly successful organization, mostly in Quebec, in terms of like, I think its impact, but also its growth and its access to capital. But if we look at how the organization was initially created in 2011, it was created at a time when, and it was similarly like until recently, at a time when there were no conversations around issues facing Black communities specifically. And actually it was even a taboo to talk about issues that Black communities are faced with. So here I was founding an organization in a context where I had, and I think it's a fair thing to make, I had to address issues that were related to youth, education, poverty, without naming the fact that it was targeting mostly Black communities, and it was framed in a way that was basically, in my view, colorblind, to honor the way the system was designed. So that's one thing that I think is important to mention. The other thing is, I have many attributes in terms of where I grew up, schools that I attended, the fact that I'm from the business community that has facilitated access to capital. But you know what? I know so many people, so many Black people who had ideas that are similar to mine, but that never could get them off the ground because of the lack of access and because of the way the system is designed. So that's one thing that makes me, to some extent, I would say privileged, but it makes me think of how many people would have had similar ideas that couldn't get their idea off the ground. So that's one thing that is probably a reflection of how little organizations are founded. And I think that Pour Trois Points is an exception to that because there are other attributes that have created a context where that made it favorable for us to raise funds. Now, moving forward and coming to the current context, there's two things that I wish to highlight. The fact that for many reasons, we framed the organization as being an organization that wasn't explicitly Black-led or a Black organization. Now that the conversation is growing around tackling issues that face Black communities, there are systems that actually decide for us if we're Black-led or we're not Black-led. And here I am as a Black founder, trying to make the rules. We've been playing the rules of the game, and I'm being told that we're not Black enough, even though we're serving. I'm a Black founder. I have Black colleagues, and we're serving communities that are not only Black but are largely Black. So this is a way in how the system decides for us who we want to be. And the last thing I'll mention about that, the other thing, which is a bias that I think is important. When I speak to funders, not all funders, but many funders, mostly corporations, I'm being called because they want to invest in Black-led organizations or organizations that support Black youth, for example. But they always tell us that we're visible enough and we're big enough, and they discard us from the conversation, but we're still a very small organization compared to our potential. So in the way it's seen, it's like there's an unbiased understanding, or no, there's an unconscious understanding that we're big enough, or we're too big. But if we compare Pour Trois Points to so many other organizations that are national, the potential is still there. So basically, there's an imposition on the fact that a Black-led organization can be big, but not as big as others. And I think that this is a very subtle thing to look at. If we're looking at funding organization, the importance is on how much we want them to grow. And I think that there's this assumption that Black-led organizations still need to be small, and the piece of the pie still needs to be little. And I think we need to challenge that assumption.
There was a lot there. One of the things that I'm fascinated and I hope somebody will be able to pick up on this, is the idea that for every porte-à-point, there are unnamed number of organizations that never got off the ground, specifically because of the funding ecosystem that's existed. I wonder what that means in terms to our communities of the challenges that we have, that we wish we could have addressed, but didn't have the means to or the opportunity to. I think that's something for us to think about, and I hope that folks have taken that away. Sadie, I saw your hand. Why don't I go to you next?
Yeah, well, I just a couple of comments. Jackie, thank you so much. One of the things I love about our American colleagues is just the naming piece, just to name things and name it very, very clearly. And it's really interesting to hear kind of an international, outside the country perspective, and the comparison to Brazil, really fascinating, because we are a gentler, kinder people, we tell ourselves, but we are also people who are very afraid of naming things out loud. And I think that is very, very true in philanthropy in this country, for sure, that there is a real aversion sometimes to actually naming things out loud. The second thing that I just wanted to comment on, and Fabrice, thank you so much. I mean, that whole thing about, yeah, you're there, but don't be big enough. Don't be bigger, right? Don't, like, this is the pie we've ascribed to you, and the identity pieces, which, who gets to decide who is brown enough or black enough, and who is the arbitrator of that kind of, who holds the ultimate kind of decision-making power on that. This is a paradigm that just penalizes and provides excuses to not fund communities of color and Indigenous communities, and especially Black communities. And I think I really thank you for just really calling that out as well, because there is definitely that. And the third thing I'll say is that when we talk about agency, at the end of the day, agency to decide what is important, how you want to grow, where you want to grow, those things all belong to you as the leader of an organization and your board to decide. And I think that any kind of systemic intervention that takes that power away from folks is, should be challenged and challenged all the time. And the final thing, Jackie, just in terms to pick up on the human rights around access to capital, we know that this is relational.
Mm-hmm.
We know access is about relationships, and we know that access is about proximity to money.
Mm-hmm.
And, if you're part of communities that don't have that social capital,
Mm-hmm.
that don't have that access, that don't have that proximity, how are you going to build the trust? Because we talk a lot about trust-based philanthropy.
Mm-hmm.
And how are we going to build that trust if we can't get close? And for Black communities especially, if you can't get close to the source of the funding to build that trust, like how does that work? It's a never-ending loop, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Sadie, sorry, Jacqueline, do you have a quick hot pursuit on that? And then I want to get to Rebecca.
Oh, I'm just affirming everything that's said. If you can't name it, you can't fix it.
That's a great. That's an excellent point.
Yeah, and then there are so many implicit biases rooted in anti-Black racism in the very structure of philanthropy and how the decision-making processes work. And that's one of the reasons there is this global call for true participatory grant making, or it's called trust-based grant making, is one of our principles that I'll talk about later. But I think the panelists have hit the nail on the head in terms of key barriers that disadvantage communities of color.
Thank you. Rebecca, I'm going to get to you in one moment. I think I saw Fabrice with a quick hot pursuit. Fabrice, why don't you take it away?
Yeah, I'll just mention very quickly, because I do believe that it's important to connect like the theory with a few stories to really nail down like what we're talking about. And I do agree with the trust-based fundraising, and I look forward to hearing you, Jacqueline, on that. You know, and I mentioned one other story about the lack of access to funding. I've heard, and this hasn't happened only once to me. I mean, it happened like twice or even 3 times. Situations where funders were internally had decided that it was enough to fund one Black-led organization, and they were excluding the others who were applying because there was already one Black-led organization that was in the portfolio, irrespective of the fact that the organizations were not the same. The criteria was, it's a Black organization, then you have so many different needs, but they have chosen that one token organization that is being funded. So that is one that significantly reduces the access, because you can imagine there's many, many needs, but because there's that one chosen one that is in the door that has the relationship, the others are automatically excluded. So creating systems that prevent that from happening is crucially important. So I wanted to point that out as well.
Thank you, Fabrice. Rebecca, I think that lines us up really neatly for the next question. So we've heard that the current ecosystem of philanthropy just isn't working for Black communities. Your colleagues have talked about the different ways that happens, whether it's, you know, having only one winner per foundation, whether or not we have enough ability to have trust-based philanthropy so that we can fund the projects where they need to be. We've heard a little bit about the makeup of decision makers not reflecting the communities themselves. I wonder, based on all of what you've just heard, if you can comment on one of the other recommendations in the report, and that was the creation and the urgent need for a dedicated philanthropic foundation that would support Black communities, given what we just heard. As one of the folks leading to establish a foundation of that kind, can you tell us a little bit about what that foundation would mean for Black communities and how it would address some of the criticisms you just heard?
Absolutely. So in Canada, we have 1.2 million people who are Black. And what we do not have is a philanthropic home for Black communities, a place where there is always access to capital and ability to know that you don't have to prove that you're Black enough. You don't have to prove that the solutions that you have are going to work in your communities. You don't have to prove that your level of suffering is something that warrants a few, as we've heard, a few cents to the hundreds of dollars that are going to other communities. So the Foundation for Black Communities exists to ensure that every Black person in Canada can thrive, and that all Black communities have the agency in defining their own future. And I think what we've heard across this panel is really what it looks like when you don't have agency in defining your own future. And what we're looking to do with the Foundation for Black Communities is ensure that it's a really community-driven approach to philanthropy that is led by and determined by Black people, so that all of the decision-making and the granting priorities is really, really rooted in the driving solutions that we know already exist. Many people will indicate that there's a lack of a pipeline for Black philanthropy, and that is absolutely not true. Black people understand their lived experiences and can determine the solutions for themselves. And it's really time that we rise to that call and have equitable funding in this country.
Thank you. I have a quick follow-up, and then I want to open up that question around what a dedicated Black foundation might mean to the other group. Rebecca, one of the things you heard just from Fabrice was the practice among certain foundations to say, hey, we filled our Black quota. Thank you for that. I wonder why funding just one has always been a satisfactory sort of benchmark. Is there a reason why foundations haven't seen Black communities as a key constituent of their work?
I would say that it's primarily that there are no Black people in the leadership, decision-making power, and advisory committees. That's a very, very big, important piece to name. And many foundations don't see themselves in Black communities, or they don't make the connection that Sadia had mentioned at the beginning of the panel, that all foundations are looking to advance social good, and therefore Black communities should be a key constituent of their work, regardless of where they're granting, whether it's in mental health, whether it's in youth development, whether it is in arts and culture. Black communities fall into all of those portfolios, and yet there's this disconnect and lack of relationship.
Great. Jackie, quick question to you.
Mhm.
We've talked about the connection between, addressing systemic anti-Black racism, addressing the issue of social and economic inequity, and tying that to funding equity. What do you think a foundation for Black communities, or a dedicated foundation for Black communities, would mean in terms of bridging that gap?
Yeah, well, I think it's important. I think it's a seminal development that will help accelerate change.
Mm-hmm.
I have a couple of cautionary statements to share based on a similar period in the US, okay? And first I will say, the movement for Black funding equity includes what we get and what we give. And as a community philanthropy, it is absolutely critical that the foundation tap the giving of the Black community in Canada and elsewhere, frankly. And it all starts with us. And although it's often not recognized by society in general that sees us as the supplicants of the world, the fact is Black people in various countries tend to give the highest proportion of their income in philanthropy.
Mm-hmm.
And so in the US, 30 years worth of studies
Mm-hmm.
using just third-party data, even census and IRS data, consistently and conclusively proves that Black people give more of their income in philanthropy than any other ethnic group in the US.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, although the newest figures need to be updated, we give about $11 billion every year.
Mm-hmm.
And what's interesting is our giving goes up in recessions typically, not down. Because the drive to give is so hardwired in our cultural DNA, we don't even call it philanthropy. So part of Black Philanthropy Month is to empower people to recognize that this giving we do, even if it's a relatively smaller amount, is over more people. And it has powered every successful social movement from the Underground Railroad to the Black Lives Matters movement. Before any of the mainstream institutional foundations caught up to us, we were on the cutting edge of innovation. So go to the Black Canadian community, root this foundation in your community's aspirations and their time, their talent, and their treasure. And don't be overly dependent on the fads, I'm just going to call it that we sometimes find right now, especially since George Floyd. A lot of corporations and mainstream foundations are doing soul searching and wanting to give. And as this brother mentioned, it can end up being tokenistic. It can end up being very short-lived and sometimes not as transparent as it should be. Also avoid the tendency generally to marginalize our giving. And so it becomes kind of a checkoff box from the corporation or the foundation, but they don't necessarily realize that whatever issue they're working on, I think somebody mentioned this, if you do not have a racial equity strategy that ensures that the giving impacts the most disadvantaged communities, foundations can't address homelessness. They can't address public health issues. There has to be a Black, an Indigenous, a Latino, an immigrant agenda, because that all adds up to serving everybody. It's not special interests, it's national and community interests.
Mhm.
And so those are just some of the arguments I would use so that the funding over time
Mhm.
doesn't wither away because it was tokenistic in the first place
Mhm.
and it was seen as special interest, not
Mhm.
realizing that everybody's special interests all added up together equals a national interest. And so I would just find every way possible to send that message and to root the assets of that foundation in the Black community so it can continue to exist when the fads and fashions change.
Thank you for that. There was a lot said so far among Rebecca and Jackie around what this foundation would mean, who it would need support from. We're going to get into that a little bit more, but I want to focus a little bit further on what exactly this dedicated sort of focus on supporting Black communities through an existing or an entity like the Foundation for Black Communities would mean. In one of our prep conversations, Fabrice, you mentioned a phrase that I want to remind you of, and that was really great to me. You called it a sense of belonging. You said that the Foundation for Black Communities would contribute to and create a sense of belonging. Can you tell me a little bit more about what you meant? Want to share that with the rest of the group? Because I thought that was really interesting.
Certainly. So, I mean, I do believe that it's not an either or, it's a both and. I think that we need philanthropy in the way that it currently operates to remain. I mean, the point is not to exclude Black organizations from other funding streams. And I mean, in this current meeting, there are many of the 4 Points funders that I have great relationships with. But if I go back to the sense of belonging, I do believe that there are things that can't even be explained, feeling like home when you're part of a group that shares some similarities. So it's a basic human trait to see that you as a Black founder of an organization, to be able to go to an organization that is supporting other Black led organizations, and there are some common understandings that are tough to address, or issues that are tough to address in other contexts. So it's basically a place of feeling home. And one place where I feel that it's particularly important, we often talk about the importance of being asset-based and not deficit-based when we tackle social issues. And I do believe that that notion of sense of belonging makes it easier to make the case for a solution for Black kids without having to make the case that there is the problem. And I wish for that to happen, because every time we talk about the work that we do, I mean, it is normal in the way philanthropy operates to talk about the issue and the solution. But I do hope that we can get to a point where obviously we're aware of the problem, but just by the fact that we're Black, it makes the case that the solution is important. And I think that this fits into the importance of having a Black-led, a Black philanthropy, a more robust Black philanthropy movement for that to happen.
Thank you for that. Sadia, we've heard a lot about Canada's plan for building back better and how everyone has a role to contribute to that. Philanthropy's role will be equally important in that step. I wonder, as we think about addressing those communities that have been most affected by the COVID-19 pandemic, and as we look at the next 5, 10, 15 years of recovery, what will funding equity mean in order to really address those issues? I wonder, as someone who's leading one of those foundations doing a significant amount of that work, I wonder what that would mean in terms of what does that mean to you? What do you think the role of philanthropy there looks like? And again, if you tie that maybe a little bit back into how a Foundation for Black Communities would be an association or associated with that.
Sure. Yeah. A couple of things. So Fabrice, you touched on having an asset-based approach, and I think scarcity, especially within the philanthropic sector, pits us against each other as communities, and we have to call that out, and we can't let that be the norm. There is enough sunshine for all of us, and there is more than enough sunshine for Black communities. So it's very much, it is a paradigm. You have to make a conscious paradigm shift to say that we don't live in a space of scarcity within the sector. So, and we should be honest about that. The second piece is, Inspirit was one of the few foundations, I think, who didn't actually put out a statement after everything that happened over the summer. And that was very deliberate. That was very thoughtful. It was very kind of, it's a lot of discussion around it. And one of the reasons we didn't is that we didn't feel like, unless we actually had action tied to it, that it was our place. And until we could actually tie some significant action related to a commitment within philanthropy, you know, I think moving forward, like a foundation for Black communities can only thrive, and just from what I've heard you and Rebecca speak about previously, can only thrive if there's actually some sort of an endowment, if there's some sort of a permanent, the building blocks are being put in place, so that we get beyond this moment, and a year from now we're not back at this conversation around, oh, how do we build, you know, this foundation, that the bricks actually get laid at this moment, and so that, you know, so that there is some sense of belonging, that permanence that others have spoken about. And I think the sector really needs to rise to the occasion at this moment. We're having lots of conversations internally about this, and I'm sure others are too, but we need to actually move at this moment. We've been given a moment to do this.
Thank you. Thank you. Rebecca, in the past, I've heard you say that philanthropy is a safety net for our national safety net. Tell me a bit more about what you mean when you say that, and how that relates to maybe what Sadie just spoke about the role that a Foundation for Black Communities will play, but also the larger play that philanthropy, the larger role that philanthropy has to assume as we think about creating a more fair, just, and equitable society as a whole.
So when I think about the needs that are in Black communities right now, and where we find ourselves today in a pandemic, facing anti-Black racism, and the implications of recession and health, Black communities are being decimated at this moment. And the call to action for the philanthropic sector is to recognize that this is a moment when you doubly invest, when you really look at your priorities and assess on an equitable stance, where is the deepest need? As Jackie has said in this call, you know, Black communities and our philanthropy, when there is a need, we rise and we double down on those efforts. And so what we have is a moment and a call to action for philanthropy to really, really invest in Black communities at this time, when we know that we're not looking at, can we recover? We were already disadvantaged before the pandemic came in place. So it's imperative. The time is now to make these investments.
Great. Any hot pursuits before we get to our next question? I'll give maybe a bit of airtime for any panelists. If there's any last thoughts that they had on this matter. Great. So, Dr. Copeland, I have a question for you. Your Black Philanthropy Month initiative has reached, if my last count is correct, 17 million people in over 30 countries.
Well, I don't want to split hairs, but it's actually 18 million in 60 countries. You know, so
I've never been that great at math.
And it's our initiative. It's the whole world that's bought into this and is organizing it. So
approximately 19 million people, and in over 30 countries. And one of the things you raise is the important topic of Black funding equity. Your work around creating a global equity funding pledge for Black communities is a key part of that work. I was wondering if you could share a bit of that, what some of those principles are, and how they might address some of the gaps you've heard from our co-panelists, and maybe some lessons that the Foundation for Black Communities can take away.
Okay, thanks for that good question. So let me tell you where these came from in the first place. Black Philanthropy Month is about to turn 10, be 10 years old in August. And until last year, although we focused on key issues facing Black communities everywhere, it was more of a celebration, kind of looking at only the empowerment end of Black philanthropy, Black giving. However, with the trifecta of crises that started really the first quarter of last year, so the COVID pandemic and its disproportionate impact on Black people, then there were the very public lynchings of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and others, and the uprisings. And then, you know, the universe wanted to remind us all that climate change was real. And so California was burning, there was flooding and almost undeniable impact of global warming. And so we shifted, realizing that we will need like a Marshall level plan effort, like Rebecca was saying, to rebuild Black communities, and philanthropy cannot do it all. Our philanthropy or the philanthropy of other institutions can't really fund the recovery alone. And so we started to become cross-sector, looking at giving from philanthropy, but also investment from the corporate and VC and sector. And so we have come up, we had at our Black Philanthropy Month annual summit, all of the participants voted essentially on what they thought would be the 10 most effective and impactful ways to accelerate funding equity for Black communities in a way that would actually address the issues and not just do token giving, and also would address the long-term inequities as we get ready for COVID recovery. And I think everyone has received these funding equity principles. There's a pledge associated with it. So far, we have about 25 signatories to the pledge. We're looking for more. So if your organization already believes in these principles or think you could get there, please sign the pledge. Our global movement is basically saying that if enough organizations sign this pledge, and then we all together have some sort of monitoring mechanism to see if country by country Black funding equity is improving, we'll be able to promote systems change. So I'm just going to focus on a few of the principles for the interest of time, but one of them that's most important is number 4. And it says, trust us for a change. And I'm just going to read the 2 sentences. They're very short. Anti-Black racist biases about Black inferiority and incompetence have historically resulted in inequitable funding. Black innovators and entrepreneurs should have an equal opportunity for funding. There can be no equity or racial justice without fair funding. And I think that's what we've been talking about this morning. We struggled over how to language this so that it was clear and direct with a laser-like focus on some of the unconscious assumptions of superiority and inferiority that we've been discussing this morning that end up contributing to lack of funding. And then also wanted to talk about number 7. And I mentioned this earlier in the conversation, that it is also about what we continue to do for ourselves, preserving the Black, ancient and long-term Black philanthropy practice of self-reliance and mutual support. So that might be through our churches, our sororities, fraternities, voluntary association, whatever the institutional or community-based mechanism to continue that giving and have conversations about what we can do as Black philanthropists to help each other and our broader community. And then I wanted to talk about and be inclusive of all of the diversity within the Black community, which is actually our eighth and our ninth and our 10th principle. But with all of the public proclamations by corporations and foundations, especially after the 2020 uprisings, which became global, it's really important that those well-intentioned donor institutions have very public and transparent annual funding goals. There's a lot of questions right now about some of the corporations and foundations that made commitments. What's happened to those commitments? Have they regressed into token giving? Are they actually having an impact? How multi-year would it be? Is this just kind of a one-time I gave at the office effort, or something that can be used to make funding to Black communities more equitable on an ongoing basis? So I would encourage everyone to read all 10 of the principles, to realize they came from the community globally. Almost 36 countries actually participated in this part of our initiative. And together we can finally make a change, because I've been talking about this and many other people for decades, and it's time to make a difference together.
Thank you so much, Jackie. I want to make sure we want to spend maybe about 2 more minutes with the panel, then open it up to the audience for more questions and answers. One key question that I'm sure that will come up, and I figured we'd offer a little bit more clarity. So this comes to you, Rebecca. The report the unfunded report looked at the broken relationship between Black Canadians in this country and Canadian philanthropy. Characterizing that broken relationship was the incredibly low amount of funding that was going to our community through the community-based organizations that were servicing the needs of our community. The recommendation that stems from the report then follows that a foundation dedicated to Black communities is created, which is what you're working on now. What exactly would the Foundation for Black Communities do? And what exactly are you asking the philanthropic sector to help with in order for you to achieve your work?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, I'm happy to answer that. The Foundation for Black Communities will operate in 3 priority areas. First, giving granting to nonprofits, charities, and social movement leaders and to achieve their work. So ideally, just granting, or to make it more precise, granting to Black communities specifically. Secondly, being a partner to the philanthropic sector. So we recognize that there is no first and only in this space. We don't want the Foundation for Black Communities to be the only foundation granting to Black communities. We needed a large funding ecosystem to ensure that that ability to build back better is in place, and that Black communities can be adequately supported. And finally, the Foundation for Black Communities will be advancing policy that will ensure that Black communities are on the priorities in many different spaces. So that's what the Foundation for Black Communities will do. How can the philanthropic sector support and help is very, very simple. There is an open call for partnership. So join us on this journey. Share your knowledge, share your granting practices with the many people around the table, creating the Foundation for Black Communities. And finally, resourcing. What we're looking to do is build an endowment for the Foundation for Black Communities, and we will not be able to grant to Black communities if we don't have an endowment to grant from. So that's the call to the sector, is really to join us in partnership so that we can ensure that subsequent reports like Unfunded will not have to come out, so that we can really see Black communities as a priority across the sector. Lee-Ben, you're on mute.
Oh man, we had an ongoing bet about who would get called up for being on mute first. I lost. Well, thank you so much, Rebecca, for that, and sort of explaining a little bit more about the foundation. I think this is a good point for us to go into our question and answer period, and maybe pick a few questions that from the crowd that we can answer. So we'll take a few. Jihan, do you have a few that you'd like us to answer? Or should I just pick myself?
Please go ahead. Yes. You can go
Okay,
ahead
great.
if you'd like.
There was a question here that came from, and forgive me, I'm just trying to find it. It was from Jonas Hassan, I believe. Jihan, if you could help me just quickly locate that question, because I thought it was really important.
Yeah, same here.
Yep, it said, will the Foundation for Black Communities have a spend down policy? If I can interpret that question, my understanding, I think, is there sort of an end date as to when a Foundation for Black Communities would have, or do you see a longer horizon? I guess, Rebecca, this question's to you.
Yeah, I'm happy to answer it. So Jonas, thank you for the question. I think what is important to name is the woeful underfunding that we see to Black communities right now really puts us in a position to recognize that we need a long-term sustainable home for Black communities. So at this point, it's difficult to determine where we're going to be down the line. And so our priority is ensuring that we have the resources on hand now, and that the community will determine the way that the foundation is shaped and will live and grow. So it's difficult to say today what the policy will be, but it's our priority at this moment is ensuring that the foundation exists and is well endowed.
Thank you for that. Another question that I think is just open to everyone here, it says, how do you marry the fact that many organizations are now talking about EDI initiatives, even when it comes to outward funding, but internally treat their BIPOC staff inequitably? How does one reconcile this? I think that's an interesting question around, performance versus practice.
Yeah, I can take a shot at this one. Equity, like charity, starts in the home.
Mm-hmm.
And so, although our principles don't talk about this explicitly, it's really critical to do some internal review and housekeeping to ensure that as an organization, one isn't being hypocritical in funding organizations, but essentially oppressing one's staff.
Mm-hmm.
And there are a whole range of diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging tools that
Mm-hmm.
can be used to give you sort of a private report card
Mm-hmm.
of how you're doing as an institution, and many consultants and organizations that can help you get your house in order.
Mm-hmm.
That's been one of the critiques of many of the corporations that have been thankfully willing to increase funding to Black communities, but don't have any people of color on their board or in their C-suites. And if they do, many of the staff are relegated to lower level positions with glass ceilings and boxes that don't allow them to grow or move up the ladder. And so it really is a whole mind, body, soul process. And I remind people that this is just doing what most of our constitutions say we do. That we provide equal opportunity to all people just because they're human beings, and it's an inherent right. And so for me, this is just about walking the talk of our democratic journey.
Right. There's a question that's coming to me privately, and I kind of want to share it. Why should the Foundation for Black Communities need to do this work? Is this work that the foundation world shouldn't be doing on its own? That's an interesting question. Is it either or to you, Sadia?
No, it's not an either or. I think that for most communities of color, nothing changes until we push for it. Nothing. But the burden doesn't belong to Black communities alone. It doesn't belong to Indigenous communities alone. It doesn't belong to other like brown communities alone. So I think it's not an either or, it's an and. And I think one of the biggest challenges within the sector is that we have so few people in leadership who actually come from any of those backgrounds or have a lived experience that actually speaks to a lot of these issues, you know, even regional issues in this country. There's huge disparity from one end of the country to the other. And so anytime that we can look at, for me personally, in a leadership role where we can look at an and, how can we work together? And, you know, Rebecca and the folks involved with the Foundation for Black Communities, I mean, we've had lots of conversations around where we can lean in, how can we work together, how can we support? Because the burden is not yours alone, it belongs to all of us. But I think the leadership does have to come from within the Black communities, right? Because to own it, to frame it, to kind of make us accountable, I think, more than aware, because I think, you know, the two are not the same things. And so it's all of us, and I just hope moving forward that we can stop these kind of superficial these superficial fights for resources, and because I know that, you know, resources are scarce, but we don't have to behave in a way that pits us against each other. So so it belongs to all of us.
Thank you so much, Sadie. Honestly, I wish we had some more time for these questions. These conversations, I think, always leave us realizing that we never have enough time in the day to sort of to get to sort of a finish line. And I don't think there ever should be a finish line for these conversations. So I hope this is an opportunity for folks to take advantage of these conversations as they happen throughout this month, and for the rest of the year. With that said, you know, it's with great regret that I announced the ending of this panel. I want to take a quick moment to thank all of you who've made your contributions, and all those of you who have attended and asked really wonderful questions. One of the things that we'll do is we'll take some of these questions away and hopefully provide some of those answers as a part of the post-panel resources. With that said, I'd like to now hand it over to Jean-Marc for some closing remarks. Thanks again for everyone.
There you go. You're not alone, Liban. I also mute myself. So thanks, Liban, and all the panelists for this very important conversation today. We're on a journey, that journey toward justice and inclusion and equality for all. And but it's also we're in the moment that we must reckon with. And so that as you saw in the chat, PFC is organizing a meeting on the 23rd, the workshop on the 23rd of February at lunchtime, to drill down on some of the issues that have been raised in this, and the question about the plans of the Foundations for Black Communities and the other philanthropic community can support it. So I invite you to, if you're a PFC member, a funder, to join us in that workshop in 2 weeks from now. The other elements, you'll see that as you pop out of this conversation, there's a short survey about the session today. So please respond and give us the input to make sure that we bring the programming that's most relevant for the membership, philanthropic member community moving forward. And the third element is that as I just mentioned, we can't let these moments go by us. And the point that Sadia and many others have made throughout the last hour is the Unfunded report has been a wake-up call for the community, and then it kind of has triggered a fair amount of soul searching. Let's act on it. As I mentioned at the beginning, it's part of PFC new strategic framework and new statement of values that we want to promote the growth of the equity-seeking philanthropy in the ecosystem. And we're looking forward to the day that we can welcome the Foundation for Black Communities as a member of PFC. So on that note, I wish all of you a great afternoon, and let's continue to work in the conversation. So merci beaucoup.